The courtroom was electric. Serafina Dubois, immaculate in white Chanel, was about to become the richest divorcee in New York. She glanced at her husband Richard, and then at the woman in the back row, his first wife Eleanor. Serafina let out a small, mocking laugh. The first wife was a ghost, a nobody, a relic. Her lawyer was demanding the Hamptons estate, the Aspen Lodge, and half of his $300 million company. But the gavel was about to fall on her, not him. The judge cleared her throat, looked Serafina dead in the eye, and delivered the one line that changed everything. The air in courtroom 3B of the New York County Supreme Court was thick with the scent of old wood, expensive perfume, and pure, unadulterated avarice. Today was Serafina Dubois's victory lap. She sat perched on the hard wooden bench, as if it were a throne, her posture impeccable. At 29, she was a masterpiece of curated perfection. Her hair, a cascade of honey blonde, was pulled into a sleek chignon. Her suit was not black, the color of mourning, but a brilliant, almost defiant winter white. It was Chanel, of course. Across her lap, her fingers adorned with a 10-carat yellow diamond, idly stroked the crocodile leather of her Hermès Birkin. She was the wronged wife, and she was about to be fabulously compensated for her suffering. Across the aisle sat the source of that suffering, her soon-to-be ex-husband, Richard Vance. Where Serafina was vibrant, Richard, at 45, was a study in beige. His expensive suit hung on him. His face was pallid, and his eyes the same eyes that had once charmed her. Charmed investors, charmed everyone, were fixed on his trembling hands. He was a lion reduced to a nervous house cat. And as for the division of assets, boomed Gideon Shaw, Serafina's lawyer, my client is entitled to 50% of all marital property acquired during their 5-year union. This includes, but is not limited to, the penthouse on Park Avenue. Serafina turned him out, her gaze drifting. She'd already won. The past 5 years had been a whirlwind. She'd met Richard when she was a 24-year-old intern at his burgeoning private equity firm, Vance Capital. He was married, of course. But to Serafina, married was just a logistical hurdle, not a moral one. The wife, Eleanor, was forgettable. A mousy, quiet woman from his before life. Serafina was his after. She had orchestrated his infatuation, his agonizing decision to leave, and the brutal divorce that followed. She had held his hand and picked the restaurant when he told his children. And she had stood beside him at their lavish wedding in Lake Como, just 6 weeks after his divorce from Eleanor was finalized. Now, it was her turn. Richard, it turned out, had a fatal flaw. He was a serial predator. He had made the sloppy mistake of starting an affair with a 22-year-old yoga instructor. Serafina found the texts. But instead of crying, she called Gideon Shaw. She would do to the yoga instructor what she had done to Eleanor, erase her. But first she would take Richard for everything he had. Mr. Shaw, Judge Annabel Croft interrupted, her voice like gravel. I understand the list of assets is extensive. Let's move on to the core dispute. Mr. Halloway. Richard's lawyer. A nervous man named Arthur Halloway stood. Your Honor, Mr. Vance contests the valuation of Vance Capital. He argues that Ms. Dubois's contributions were nominal. A sharp, unladylike snort escaped Serafina's lips. Nominal. She had been his greatest asset. She hosted the parties, charmed the clients, and rebuilt his image from family man to power broker. She was a hostess, Your Honor. Halloway pressed. I was his wife. Serafina snapped, her voice echoing in the silent room. That is precisely what we are here to determine the value of, Judge Croft said, looking down at her files. Now, before we continue, I see we have an observer. Serafina hadn't noticed the back door of the courtroom swing open. A woman stood there hesitant but resolute. She wore a simple navy blue coat, her brown hair was pulled back in a simple clip, and she carried a worn leather satchel. She looked, Serafina thought, with a curl of her lip like a librarian. It was the librarian. Eleanor Vance. Richard flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible spasm. Serafina's eyes narrowed. Why was she here? This was her divorce, her payday. Eleanor walked silently, deliberately down the central aisle and took a seat in the back row, directly behind Richard. Serafina leaned over to Gideon Shaw. "What is she doing here?" she hissed, not bothering to lower her voice. "Come to see the show." Then Serafina did something that sealed her fate. She turned locked eyes with the woman she had replaced, and she smiled a wide, slow, triumphant smile. And then a sound. A small, suppressed, but entirely audible laugh. It was a laugh of pure mockery of final victory. Eleanor Vance met her gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. Her expression didn't change at all. "Ms. Dubois," the judge's voice cracked like a whip. "Is there something amusing you'd like to share with the court?" "No, Your Honor," Serafina said, composing herself, though the smirk remained. "Just an old ghost." "Indeed," Judge Croft said, looking at the door. "But the court has been made aware of a new motion. A motion that I must admit is unprecedented." Gideon Shaw shot to his feet. "Your Honor, we received no such motion." "It was filed this morning," the judge said, shuffling papers. "By a Ms. Evelyn Reed on behalf of her client, Ms. Eleanor Vance." Serafina's smirk faltered. The laugh died in her throat. "What? She has no standing here. Her divorce was 5 years ago. This is my day." A new woman, sharp in a charcoal gray suit, stood up from the seat next to Eleanor. "Your Honor, my client, Eleanor Vance, is here to assert her standing." "Standing as what?" Shaw boomed. "A disgruntled first wife. The court has no time for this." Evelyn Reed smiled, a thin, dangerous smile. "As Mr. Richard Vance's only legal and current wife." Eleanor Vance had not always been a ghost. 20 years ago, she was Eleanor Matheson, a brilliant, ambitious economics major at NYU. That's where she met Richard Vance, a charismatic, charming, and utterly penniless business student. He had the ambition. She had the brains. He would quote the Wall Street Journal. She would quietly correct his math. They were for a decade an unstoppable team. They married a year after graduation in a simple ceremony at City Hall. She worked 2 jobs, one as a bookkeeper, one as a waitress, to put him through his MBA at Columbia. His first business plan, the one that would eventually become Vance Capital, was written on their tiny laminate-topped kitchen table. She was the one who found the flaw in his initial algorithm, the one who suggested the market niche he would later exploit. She typed the proposals. She balanced the books. She was co-founder partner and chief strategist, all while holding the title of supportive wife. Their first 10 years were a blur of hard work and shared dreams. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They bought a modest house in Westchester. When Vance Capital finally landed its first major client, a $50 million infusion from a stubborn old money family, it was Eleanor who had spent 6 months patiently, meticulously earning the trust of the family's matriarch. Richard threw the party. Eleanor had built the foundation. And then the money came. And with the money came the change. It was slow at first. The modest house became a starter home. Richard started traveling more. Client dinners stretched into late nights. He traded his worn-out Timex for a Rolex, his Ford for a Maserati. He started using words like optics and synergy, and he started looking at Eleanor as if she were a piece of outdated furniture. She was 40. She was tired. She had dedicated her entire adult life to his dream, which she had always thought was their dream. Then came Serafina. Eleanor was no fool. She saw the signs, the new secret-coded phone, the sudden obsession with the gym, the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his shirts. When she confronted him, he performed the most masterful act of gaslighting in his career. She was tired, he said. She was letting herself go. She was paranoid. Serafina Dubois, he had laughed, a deep, dismissive sound. She's an intern, Ellie. She's a child. Are you really that insecure? Yes, she was. And yes, she should have been. The day he left her was a masterclass in cruelty. It wasn't a tearful confession. It was a business transaction. He came home one Tuesday, handed her a folder, and said, "I've retained Gideon Shaw. He'll be in touch with your lawyer." Eleanor didn't have a lawyer. She could barely afford the mortgage, which she suddenly learned was in his name only. The divorce was a blitzkrieg. Gideon Shaw, the same shark, now representing Serafina, was unleashed upon her. While Eleanor was trying to find a therapist for her devastated teenage daughter, Shaw was burying her in paperwork, filing motions, and draining her modest savings. Richard claimed she had no material contribution to Vance Capital. He claimed the company's success was all his. He produced documents which she later realized were fraudulent, showing the company was heavily leveraged. He offered her a generous one-time payout of $150,000 and the custody of their 2 shell-shocked children. "Take it, Eleanor," her own overwhelmed second-rate lawyer advised her. "He'll drag this out until you have nothing. He'll take the kids. Just take the deal." So she did. She signed the papers. She was Eleanor Vance, the ex-wife. She moved to a small rented apartment in a different school district. She got a job at the local library, the only place that would hire a 41-year-old woman with a 20-year gap in her resume. She watched from the sidelines as Richard, free and clear, married Serafina Dubois 6 weeks later in a glittering multi-million-dollar ceremony in Italy. She saw the photos in Vogue, the new improved Mrs. Vance. Eleanor became a ghost. She focused on her children. She learned to live on very little. She clipped coupons. She bought second-hand. And every night she would lie awake, the humiliation and rage a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She wasn't angry that he had left her. She was angry that he had erased her. He had stolen her work, her life, her name, and given it all to a 24-year-old. She lived like that for 5 years. 5 years of quiet, invisible dignity. 5 years of being the first draft. Until the letter came. Serafina Dubois hadn't just married Richard. She had acquired him. From her perspective, her story was one of pure American ambition. She came from a middle-class family in Ohio, armed with a pretty face and a ruthless intelligence. She hadn't gone to NYU to get a degree. She'd gone to get a husband. The internship at Vance Capital was a calculated move. She had researched the CEO, Richard Vance, for months. She read his interviews, studied his type, and saw his weakness. His weakness was his own ego, and his wife, Eleanor, was a liability to that ego. Serafina saw it the one time she visited the office. Eleanor had brought Richard his lunch, he'd forgotten it, and a drawing from their son. She was wearing running shoes and a cable-knit sweater. She looked to Serafina's 24-year-old eyes like a mother, not a wife. Serafina made her move. She was everything Eleanor was not dazzling available, and utterly fawningly impressed by him. She made him feel like a god, and in return, he gave her his credit card. Their marriage was a non-stop 5-year party. They were the darlings of the New York social scene. Their life curated for Instagram was a blur of galas, private jets, and winters in Aspen. Serafina was a brilliant Mrs. Vance. She redecorated the penthouse, charmed his board members, and looked spectacular on his arm. She was worth every penny. But the man she married was not the man she was now divorcing. The charismatic predator she'd fallen for had a fatal flaw: he was a narcissist. And narcissists get bored. About a year ago, the signs started. The same signs Eleanor had seen. The secret phone, the late nights at the office, the sudden passion for hot yoga. Serafina, unlike Eleanor, did not confront him. She hired a private investigator. The PI, a grizzled ex-cop named Mike, delivered the photos in a manila envelope. Richard in a sweaty tangle with a 22-year-old instructor named Autumn. Serafina's first emotion wasn't sadness. It was furious. Not at the betrayal, but at the insult. A yoga instructor. How pedestrian. How cliché. He was replacing her, his prized possession, with a new model, just as he had done before. But Serafina had learned from the master. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She smiled. She knew Richard's finances better than he did. For 5 years, she had been his shadow. She knew where the offshore accounts were. She knew about the shell corporations. She knew he had been systematically and illegally devaluing Vance Capital, on paper preparing for the day he would inevitably discard her. He was planning to do to her exactly what he had done to Eleanor. He had underestimated her. He thought she was just a pretty face. He forgot she was the one who had helped him draft the asset-hiding strategies. She immediately called Gideon Shaw. "Richard's cheating," she said, not a tremor in her voice. "I want to file. And I want to file first. I want you to freeze everything." Gideon Shaw, sensing the billion-dollar payday, was ecstatic. They would hit him hard. They would claim extreme emotional distress and dissipation of marital assets. They would argue that her contribution to Vance Capital was integral, as she was the face of the brand. Her plan was perfect. She would take 50% of the real value, not the cooked books. She would take the penthouse, the Hamptons house, and enough cash to start her own lifestyle brand. She would leave him in a rented apartment, and she would take her new 25-year-old Pilates instructor on a trip to St. Bart's. She was so close. The finish line was in sight. Today was just the final formality. So, when Eleanor Vance, the frumpy, forgotten original, walked into the courtroom, Serafina felt nothing but contempt. It was pathetic. This relic, this ghost, had no place in her world. Eleanor was the past. She, Serafina, was the present and the future. The sound of her own laugh echoing in the courtroom was the sound of her triumph. Until the other lawyer stood up. As Mr. Richard Vance's only legal and current wife. The words hung in the air, nonsensical. A buzzing started in Serafina's ears. "What?" she whispered. "What is the meaning of this, Ms. Reed?" Judge Croft demanded, her eyes flashing. "It's quite simple, Your Honor." Evelyn Reed said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the stunned silence. "My client, Eleanor Vance, and Mr. Richard Vance were never divorced. The letter had arrived on a rainy Tuesday 3 months ago. Eleanor was sorting mail at the library's front desk, her life reduced to a quiet routine of stamps, barcodes, and the polite shushing of teenagers. Tucked between a current resident flyer and a utility bill was a thick, cream-colored envelope from the Internal Revenue Service. Her blood ran cold. The IRS. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was a notice of deficiency. It claimed that she and her spouse, Richard Vance, had underreported their income for the 2022 tax year and owed $1.2 million in back taxes and penalties. Eleanor stared at it, bewildered. 2022. She had been divorced for 4 years by then. She hadn't seen Richard, let alone filed taxes with him, since 2018. She had filed single every year, reporting her modest $42,000 librarian's salary. She assumed it was a mistake. She called the number. After an hour on hold, a weary IRS agent named Brenda pulled up her file. "No, ma'am, this isn't a mistake," Brenda said flatly. "Our records show a married filing jointly return for Richard and Eleanor Vance for 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. It was filed by Mr. Vance's accounting firm." Eleanor's knees went weak. But we were divorced. I signed the papers in 2018. The decree was final." "I don't see any divorce decree in your file, ma'am," Brenda said. "As far as the federal government is concerned, you are still Mrs. Richard Vance. And ma'am, you are jointly liable for that $1.2 million. Eleanor hung up the phone and threw up in the staff bathroom. He hadn't just ruined her life, he had tethered her to his sinking ship. He had been filing fraudulent joint tax returns for 5 years after their divorce, using her name, her social security number, and her lower tax bracket, all while he was gallivanting around the world with his new wife. And now, as his finances were clearly collapsing, the IRS was coming for her. The old Eleanor would have crumpled. The old Eleanor would have called her second-rate lawyer and tried to settle. But the woman who emerged from that bathroom was not the old Eleanor. She was a woman who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. She was a ghost, and ghosts have no fear. She didn't call her old lawyer. She cashed in the small 401k from her library job, every last penny, and went to the best, most ruthless, and most expensive law firm in the city. She didn't ask for a partner. She asked for the hungriest associate. She got Evelyn Reed. Evelyn was 30, razor sharp, and had a chip on her shoulder the size of Manhattan. She hated men like Richard Vance. She listened to Eleanor's story, her eyes narrowing as she read the IRS notice. "He's been using your signature," Evelyn said, a dangerous quiet in her voice. "This is felony-level tax fraud, forgery, identity theft." "I just want to be free of him," Eleanor said. "I just want them to know I'm not his wife." Evelyn tapped the paper. "That's the problem, Eleanor. I think you might be." Evelyn spent the next 2 weeks in the digital salt mines of the New York court system. She pulled the file for Vance v. Vance, case number 30419, 2018. "This is bizarre," Evelyn said, spreading the papers on her desk a few days later. "What?" Eleanor asked. "Look." Evelyn pointed to a docket entry. "Here's your divorce petition filed by his lawyer Gideon Shaw. Here's your acceptance of service. Here's the final settlement you signed. And here is the final decree of divorce, signed by Judge Miller on October 12, 2018. "See," Eleanor said, relieved. "It's final." "Hold on," Evelyn said, her eyes scanning. "Look at this. 2 days later, October 14th, 2018. A new filing. She read it aloud. Ex parte motion to vacate final decree. Filed by Arthur Halloway on behalf of the petitioner Richard Vance. What does that mean? It means 2 days after the divorce was finalized, Richard's other lawyer, not Shaw but his quiet corporate lawyer, filed a motion to cancel it. And look at the reason: clerical error and premature filing. Parties in active reconciliation. Reconciliation, Eleanor gasped. We weren't reconciling. He was in Italy planning his wedding. I know, Evelyn said, her voice grim. And then on October 15th, motion granted, final decree vacated. Case dismissed. Eleanor stared, uncomprehending. Evelyn Reed laid it out. He played you, Eleanor. He played everyone. He needed you to think you were divorced so you wouldn't contest his marriage to Serafina. He needed you to sign that settlement so you'd be legally barred from coming after his company later. So he had his shark Shaw rush you through a settlement. The second you signed it, he had his other lawyer, Halloway, go to a different judge and vacate the entire divorce, claiming you two were getting back together. He probably told the judge you'd had a change of heart. But why? Eleanor whispered. Why go to all that trouble? Why not just stay divorced? Taxes. Evelyn said, her voice cold. And control. By staying married to you, he could file married filing jointly and save millions. He could keep you, his first and most dangerous business partner, legally muzzled. And, I suspect, he kept you as a firewall. A firewall? He's a bigamist, Eleanor. His marriage to Serafina Dubois is a sham. It's not legal, which means if she ever tried to divorce him, she'd get nothing. It's the ultimate asset protection plan. He was using his first wife to defraud his second. Eleanor was silent for a full minute, the scale of his sociopathy washing over her. He hadn't just erased her. He had kept her like a dusty, forgotten tool in a box in the attic. And now he'd been caught. He's divorcing Serafina. Eleanor said, the words suddenly clear. I saw it in the Post. She's the one divorcing him. Today. Evelyn Reed's eyes lit up. A slow, predatory smile spread across her face. Oh, this is beautiful. This is poetic. He's not just a bigamist. He's a stupid bigamist. Evelyn grabbed her coat. We're not filing a criminal complaint. Not yet. That's too slow. We are going to that divorce hearing. Right now. What do? We, my dear Mrs. Vance, Evelyn said, holding the door open, are going to watch the fireworks, and then we are going to own the factory. The silence in courtroom 3B was a living thing. It was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Serafina Dubois was frozen. Her hand still raised in a half-wave of dismissal, her mouth slightly open. The words, only legal and current wife, echoed in her head, a discordant, impossible chime. Gideon Shaw, for the first time in his 30-year career, was speechless. He looked from Evelyn Reed to the judge, his face a mask of purple-blotched confusion. Objection! He finally roared, finding his voice. This is theater. It's an ambush. This woman, he jabbed a finger at Evelyn, is not party to this proceeding, and she, pointing at Eleanor, has absolutely no standing. On the contrary, Mr. Shaw. Evelyn Reed said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. She stepped forward and placed a stack of papers on the bailiff's desk. We have standing, we have evidence, and we have a copy for you. Judge Croft. Her face, a thundercloud, glared at the document. Miss Reed, you are making an accusation of bigamy in my courtroom. You had better be able to back this up, or I will have you sanctioned for contempt. I am aware, Your Honor, Evelyn said. Please direct your attention to Exhibit A, the final decree of divorce for Vance v. Vance dated October 12, 2018. Gideon Shaw scoffed. My own office filed that I was there. It's final. Please now direct your attention to Exhibit B. Evelyn continued, her voice rising. A motion to vacate that same decree filed on October 14, 2018 by Mr. Arthur Halloway, co-counsel for Mr. Vance. And Exhibit C, the order signed by Judge Miller granting that motion. The decree was vacated. The case was dismissed. The marriage was and remains intact. A gasp rippled through the gallery. All eyes turned to Richard Vance. Richard was no longer pale. He was a slick, greenish-gray. His lawyer, Arthur Halloway, the same lawyer who had filed the motion, was staring at his own shoes, looking as if he wished the floor would open up and swallow him. Serafina's head snapped toward Richard. Rick, she whispered the first crack, appearing in her perfect facade. Rick, what is she talking about? Richard wouldn't look at her. He just stared forward, his jaw working silently. This is absurd, Gideon Shaw bellowed, trying to regain control. A clerical error. It must be my client, Ms. Dubois, was married to Mr. Vance in Lake Como, Italy on December 1st, 2018. We have the marriage certificate. It's a valid legal marriage. It's a very pretty and very expensive piece of paper, Evelyn Reed countered. But it is not a legal marriage certificate. A man cannot be married to two women at once, Mr. Shaw, not even in Italy. His marriage to Ms. Eleanor Vance supersedes it. Serafina finally found her voice. It was high and thin. No. No. You're lying. He couldn't. She looked at Richard, desperation replacing her arrogance. Rick, tell them she's lying. Tell them you divorced her. Richard Vance slowly, agonizingly turned his head. He looked at Serafina, the woman he had built a 5-year fantasy with. And in his eyes she saw nothing. No love, no remorse, just the cold, dead calculation of a man trapped. Arthur, Richard murmured to his lawyer. Arthur Halloway visibly winced. Your Honor, my client, we may need to request a continuance to review these allegations. A continuance, Judge Croft thundered, her patience snapping. Mr. Halloway, you are an officer of the court. Did you or did you not file the motion to vacate in 2018? Halloway's silence was the answer. And Mr. Vance, the judge turned her fury on him. Did you or did you not know you were still legally married to Ms. Eleanor Vance when you participated in a marriage ceremony with Miss Serafina Dubois? Richard's hands were shaking so badly he clasped them together. He said nothing. And in that moment, Serafina understood. The laughter she had directed at Eleanor just moments before, it all came rushing back, choking her. He knew. He had known this whole time, for 5 years. Their entire marriage was a lie. Her home, her name, her status. It was all built on a foundation of fraud. He had used her just as he had used Eleanor. But worse, he had made her a fool. You, she began, her voice a low, animalistic growl. You bastard! She launched herself at him. You did this to me, she shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails raking at his face. You lied to me, Richard yelped and fell back off the bench. The bailiffs surged forward, grabbing Serafina around the waist. She fought them, a screaming, kicking banshee, her white Chanel suit twisting. Order! Judge Croft slammed her gavel. Order in my courtroom, bailiff, restrain her. He ruined me! Serafina screamed, tears of pure, undiluted rage carving black mascara tracks down her face. I'll kill him! I'll kill you all! That money is mine! She was dragged, still screaming, into the hallway. Gideon Shaw stood amidst the wreckage, his own $30 million payday evaporating before his eyes. The courtroom fell silent again, the only sound Serafina's diminishing screams from the hall. Judge Croft took a long, deep breath. She looked at Richard, who was now straightening his tie, a scratch bleeding freely on his cheek. She looked at Eleanor, who sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a single silent tear tracing a path down her own cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of release. Finally, the judge looked down at the documents for the divorce of Dubois versus Vance. And then she spoke. Judge Annabelle Croft surveyed the wreckage of her courtroom. Serafina's abandoned Birkin bag lay on its side, spilling its contents, a gold Amex, a tube of $80 lipstick, a bottle of anxiety medication. Richard Vance was dabbing at his bleeding cheek with a silk pocket square. His lawyer Holloway looked physically ill, and Eleanor Vance sat a pillar of quiet dignity with her bulldog lawyer Evelyn Reed beside her. Well, Judge Croft said, her voice dripping with a dry, cold fury. This has been an illuminating morning. She fixed her gaze on Gideon Shaw, who was numbly gathering his papers. Mr. Shaw, she said. He jumped. Yes, Your Honor. You are representing Ms. Serafina Dubois in this matter, correct? Yes, Your Honor. And you are petitioning this court for a dissolution of her marriage to Mr. Richard Vance and a subsequent division of marital assets. That is correct, Your Honor. Judge Croft leaned forward, her eyes like steel traps. Mr. Shaw, how can this court dissolve a marriage that does not exist? Gideon Shaw's face, which had been pale, flushed a deep, hopeless red. Your Honor, my client, she entered into the marriage in good faith. Good faith, the judge shot back. Good faith is a shield, Mr. Shaw, not a sword. It does not magically create a legal contract where one cannot exist. Mr. Vance was not legally available to be married. His prior and I emphasize prior marriage to Ms. Eleanor Vance was never terminated. She turned her gaze on Richard. Mr. Vance, you have perpetrated a fraud on Ms. Dubois, a fraud on your first wife, a fraud on the IRS, and most foolishly a fraud on this court. Your conduct is not just immoral, it is criminal. Bigamy is a Class E felony in the state of New York. Richard's lawyer Holloway finally spoke, his voice a desperate rasp. Your Honor, this is all a terrible misunderstanding, a clerical error. Mr. Vance had every intention of— Silence, Mr. Holloway! Judge Croft roared, and for the first time her voice shook with rage. You, an officer of the court, were complicit. You filed the motion to vacate. You will have your own chance to explain your actions to the Bar Association, I assure you. Holloway turned white and sat down hard. Judge Croft returned to her primary target, Gideon Shaw. Mr. Shaw, your client, Ms. Dubois, has been petitioning for a 50% stake in Vance Capital, the judge said, reading from the file. She has been demanding the Park Avenue penthouse, the Hamptons estate, and the Aspen Lodge. Is that correct? Yes, but, Your Honor, she is by law not entitled to them. The words hit with the force of a physical blow. Under New York domestic relations law, the judge continued, as if lecturing a classroom, a party to avoid marriage such as this one is not a spouse. If you are not a spouse, you are not entitled to equitable distribution. You are not entitled to alimony. You are not entitled to anything." She looked up over her glasses at the door where Serafina had been dragged out. "Your client, Mr. Shaw, has spent the last 5 years in a state of, let's call it, unmarried cohabitation. Her relationship to Mr. Vance is not that of a wife. It is in the cold, hard eyes of the law, that of a mistress." Mistress. The word hung in the air, brutal and precise. The very thing Serafina had prided herself on not being. She had won. She was the wife. And now with one word the judge had stripped her of her entire identity. "Therefore," Judge Croft said, her voice ringing with finality, "the petition before me, Dubois versus Vance, is fundamentally invalid. There are no marital assets to divide because there is no marriage." She lifted her gavel. "This case," she declared, "is dismissed with prejudice." Bang! The sound of the gavel was deafening. Bang! "And I am referring this entire matter, Mr. Vance, for bigamy and perjury, Mr. Halloway for ethics violations, and the IRS for 5 years of fraudulent joint tax returns to the district attorney's office, effective immediately." Bang! "This court is adjourned." Judge Croft stood and swept from the room, her black robes billowing behind her. Richard Vance didn't move. He just sat staring at the wood grain of the table. He was a man who had built an empire on lies, and his entire world had just been dismantled in less than 10 minutes by a librarian and a legal associate. Evelyn Reed leaned over and gently touched Eleanor's arm. "It's over." Eleanor nodded, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she stood. She looked across the aisle at the man who had been her partner, her tormentor and her husband for 25 years. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. In them she saw no remorse, only surprise. The surprise of a predator who had just been outsmarted by his prey. Eleanor turned, and without a backward glance, walked out of the courtroom. The scene outside courtroom 3B was a different kind of chaos than the one within. The soundproofed doors muffled the bang of the gavel, but the emotional shrapnel had already hit. Serafina Dubois was slumped on a hard wooden bench, a grotesque parody of the triumphant queen who had sat there an hour earlier. Her white Chanel suit, once a symbol of her purity and victory, was now ripped at the shoulder seam from her struggle with the bailiffs. Her face, a priceless canvas that morning, was a ruin of streaked mascara and splotchy, rage-filled tears. She was no longer screaming. A terrifying, hollow silence had fallen over her. The fight was gone, replaced by the dawning icy horror of comprehension. Gideon Shaw emerged from the courtroom, his $5,000 Italian leather briefcase suddenly looking like a cheap prop. His face was gray, the face of a man who had just watched a $30 million commission vaporize. "Gideon." Serafina whimpered, the sound small and pathetic. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled. "Gideon, what do we do now? We sue him. For fraud. We sue him for emotional distress. I gave him the best years of my life. I hosted his parties. I made him." Gideon Shaw, who had fawned over her for months, looked at her with the flat, dead eyes of a fish. He loosened his silk tie. "Serafina," he said, and the fact he used her first name, not Ms. Dubois, was the first blow. "There is no we. You have no money. Your accounts, all of them, are frozen." "But they're my accounts," she shrieked, the volume rising. The household account, my private. He gave it to me." "No." Shaw said, his voice cold. He was already calculating the billable hours he'd lost. They are his accounts which you, as his putative spouse, were given access to. That access is now gone. The bank was notified by Mr. Holloway's office 10 minutes ago on the advice of his criminal counsel, who I assure you is already on his way. You are not his wife. You have no claim. But the penthouse, my things, the penthouse is an asset of Vance Capital. You are not an officer of that company. You are not a spouse. You are an occupant, and your occupancy is terminated. He snapped his briefcase shut. You're not a client, Ms. Dubois. You're a creditor, and you're at the back of a very, very long line right behind the IRS and the state of New York. Gideon, you can't, she cried, grabbing his arm. He shook her off, his disgust palpable. My retainer agreement was with the wife of Richard Vance. That person does not exist. Goodbye, Serafina. He turned and walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing. Serafina stared after him, her mouth open in a silent scream. Just then the courtroom doors opened again. This time Eleanor and Evelyn Reed emerged. Eleanor's steps were measured, her face pale, but resolute. Evelyn looked energized. Serafina's shock curdled back into pure, unadulterated venom. She scrambled to her feet, pointing a trembling 10-carat diamond-clad finger. You, she spat. The word was thick with hate. You did this. You couldn't just stay gone, could you? You couldn't stand to see him happy, you pathetic, forgotten librarian. Eleanor paused. She looked at this woman, this girl really who had built a fantasy on the wreckage of her own life. She had despised her for 5 years, hated her for sleeping in her bed, for spending her money, for playing mother to her children. But now, looking at the pure animalistic terror in Serafina's eyes, she felt nothing. Not pity, not anger. Just a vast, cold, empty closure. You're wrong, Serafina. Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the woman's hysteria. I didn't do this. You didn't do this. She gestured with her chin back toward the courtroom doors. As if on cue, they swung open again. This time it was Richard, flanked by 2 uniformed court officers. His face was ashen. His lawyer Holloway was babbling about posting bail and misunderstanding. One of the officers unclipped his handcuffs. Richard's eyes met Serafina's. There was no apology, no love, just cold reptilian panic. He did this, Eleanor finished, her voice flat. He did it to both of us. You were just so busy laughing at the first draft that you didn't realize you were just the rough copy. You, what? Serafina whispered the words, not computing. He was never going to let you win. He was never going to let anyone win. He needed you to feel superior to me, just as he needed me to feel erased by you. We were just 2 different tools in his box. Eleanor adjusted the strap of her worn leather satchel. My advice? Get a good lawyer. Oh, wait, she said, recycling Serafina's own earlier arrogance. You can't afford one. Eleanor and Evelyn walked to the elevator, not looking back. Serafina watched them go. Then she watched as the court officers placed the handcuffs on Richard's wrists. The click was sharp and final in the marble hallway. Photographers alerted by a source suddenly swarmed the corridor, flashbulbs erupting, turning the scene into a chaotic, strobing nightmare. Mr. Vance! Mr. Vance, is it true you're a bigamist? Serafina, how does it feel to be the other woman? Serafina cringed, turning her face away. The other woman. The one word she had built her entire identity on destroying. She was in the end nothing more than an expensive mistress. The fallout was nuclear. Richard Vance's perp walk was the lead story on every news site by lunch. He was charged with bigamy, 3 counts of felony tax fraud, and perjury. Vance Capital stock, which was publicly traded, was halted and then plummeted 80% in after-hours trading. Serafina's humiliation was swift and total. She took a cab back to the penthouse, but her key fob didn't work. The doorman, a man she had tipped $500 at Christmas, wouldn't meet her eye. "I'm sorry, Ms. Dubois. We've been instructed not to allow you access." "It's Mrs. Vance," she screamed, her voice cracking. "No, ma'am," the doorman said, his voice flat. "It's not." Her gold Amex was, as Gideon predicted, declined. She was locked out. Her friends, the socialites she had lunched with, suddenly had their phones turned off. She was a pariah. The next day, the New York Post cover was a split-screen Eleanor's dignified, composed face, leaving court, and Serafina's twisted in a mask of rage, being restrained by a bailiff. The headline, "The Wife and the Canife." She was last seen 2 weeks later arguing with the manager of a Manhattan mini-storage, trying to pay for a 10x10 unit with a handful of cash she'd gotten from selling her Cartier love bracelet at a cash-for-gold pawn shop. Her civil suit against Richard, filed by a bottom-feeder lawyer, was dismissed. She was just one of hundreds of creditors in his bankruptcy, and she would never see a dime. Meanwhile, 2 days after the hearing, Evelyn Reed was in a very different location, a sterile gray interrogation room at the Rikers Island intake facility. Richard Vance sat across from her, wearing an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit. The contrast with his Tom Ford suit was almost comical. He had the beginnings of a patchy beard, and his eyes were bloodshot. "Ms. Reed," he rasped, I don't know what you want. Your lawyer is busy trying to negotiate a bail package with the U.S. attorney who thinks you're a flight risk," Evelyn said, placing her briefcase on the table and opening it. "I'm not here to talk about your bail. I'm here to talk about your future, or your lack of one." "What do you want?" he repeated, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. "Money Eleanor already took." "Eleanor," Evelyn cut him off, "has taken nothing. Yet. You see, Richard, you're in a bit of a pickle. You're facing... Let's see." She pulled out a notepad. 10 to 15 years for the federal tax fraud, another 4 for the state bigamy charge, and the DA hates men like you, so he's not going to plea. Your entire life? It's over. Richard's face twitched. "I'll fight it. With what your assets are frozen. Your company is worthless. Your mistress is suing you. Your reputation is radioactive." Evelyn leaned forward. "You have one card left to play. And it's not yours. It's mine." "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your wife, Eleanor. The DA. It turns out is very interested in hearing from her. She is the primary victim of your tax fraud. Her testimony, the testimony of a loyal, wronged wife you abandoned and then used as a financial shield, will send you away for the full 15. She's scheduled to give her statement tomorrow." Richard's blood ran cold. He finally understood. What does she want?" he whispered. "It's not what she wants, Richard. It's what she's willing to take," Evelyn said. She slid 2 documents across the table. The first is a statement in mitigation of sentence. In it, Eleanor Vance, your loving and forgiving wife, tells the DA that this was all a terrible misunderstanding, that you were under extreme stress, and that she believes you've learned your lesson. She will humbly ask for leniency. Richard's eyes widened with relief. She'll do that. "She will," Evelyn said, "as soon as you sign the second document." She pushed the other file forward. It was much thicker. This, Evelyn said, is a transfer of ownership agreement and a final stipulation of divorce. You will transfer 51% of your controlling shares in Vance Capital to her. You will also sign over full ownership of the Westchester house you once shared, which is currently held by the corporation. In exchange, she will grant you a swift, uncontested divorce, effective immediately, and she will sign the mitigation statement. Richard stared at the paper. 51%. That's everything. That's my company. It was never your company, Richard, Evelyn said, her voice dropping. It was her company, the one she built with you, the one you stole. You're not losing your company. You're just giving it back. This is extortion, he hissed. This, Evelyn said, standing up and closing her briefcase, is the only deal you're going to get. Sign it, and Eleanor tells the DA you're a misguided fool who deserves a second chance. You'll probably serve 3 to 5. Don't sign it, and she'll walk in there tomorrow and tell the gods honest truth. You'll be 60 years old before you see the outside of a prison cell. The choice is yours. She walked to the door and knocked for the guard. You have 1 hour to decide. Your lawyer has already seen the offer. He's advising you to take it. An hour later, a guard brought Evelyn Reed the signed, notarized documents. 6 months later, Eleanor Vance walked into the main boardroom on the 48th floor of the Vance Capital building. The name on the glass door was New EMV Capital Group. Her initials. She was not the mousy, invisible woman from the courtroom. She was 46 years old, and she looked for the first time in 2 decades like herself. She wore a perfectly tailored, razor-sharp navy blue Armani suit. Her hair, which she'd once hidden in a clip, was cut in a sleek, modern bob that framed her intelligent, watchful eyes. The remaining board members, the ones she hadn't fired yet, were already seated. They were Richard's men, old money dinosaurs, who had snickered at her for years. Today, they were silent, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. Eleanor took her place at the head of the table, in Richard's chair. She placed her leather satchel, the same one she'd carried into court, on the table. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the silent room. "I'm sure you've all read the third quarter restructuring plan. We will be dissolving the lifestyle and entertainment funds. Those were Mr. Vance's vanity projects. We are refocusing on our core strategy, algorithmic market analysis." One of the older men, a man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Ms. Vance. Eleanor, that algorithm is 2 decades old. Richard himself said it was outdated," Eleanor finished for him. She looked him dead in the eye. "That's because Mr. Vance never understood it. I wrote that algorithm. And for the past 5 years, from my desk at the Westchester Public Library, I've been refining it." She opened her satchel and pulled out a single, simple flash drive. "This," she said, "is the real EMV Capital. Our entire model is about to change. Your compliance is expected. Your contributions are welcome. But your loyalty to the past is a liability." She looked around the table, meeting the eyes of every single man who had once dismissed her as Richard's little wife. "He's in a minimum security prison in upstate New York. I am the CEO. Are there any questions?" There were none. Eleanor nodded once. "Good. Then let's get to work." In the end, Seraphina's laugh in that courtroom was the last laugh she'd ever have at Eleanor's expense. She learned the hard way that when you build your life on someone else's ruins, you'd better check if the foundation is stable. Richard Vance learned that fraud and ego can build an empire, but truth and a smart, underestimated woman can bring it all crashing down. But this story isn't just about revenge. It's about reclamation. Eleanor Vance didn't just get her money back. She got her life back. She took back her name, her power, and her story. What do you think, was Serafina a villain, or just another one of Richard's victims? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. This story is a powerful reminder that the truth always comes out, and sometimes the person you dismissed as a ghost is the one holding all the power. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe for more real-life drama.